from William Shakespeare. William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, started the first commercial brewery in his new colony in 1663. And as you would expect, with the name Samuel Adams, that gentleman was also a brewer by trade. Come the Stamp Act of 1765, and a fee for taverns in the form of special stamps, amongst other demands by the British. Of course, we had the Boston Tea Party. I noticed they didn't pour beer into the water, but what they did do was recruit and retain an army. And one way to retain and to recruit an army is to give them beer. And so beer, I believe it was about a quart or 2 pints for each soldier, that was the, I want to use the word bribe, but I will say that was the temptation to join the army. In the Revolutionary War, the colonists' beer supply was in jeopardy because the British were being thoroughly unsporting and stopping importing ales into the country. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and other patriots and politicians were amateur brewers, and they sponsored and championed legislation which encouraged and assisted American citizens to go into the brewing of beer on a commercial scale. Thomas Jefferson is a hero of mine. He is the guy who was quoted as saying, "I wish to see this beverage become common." What he was talking about was beer, because Jefferson was observing people drinking the distilled beverages and drinking them to excess, and he was observing the disadvantage this would have for society, whereas beer drinkers were drinking a beverage of moderation, and that is what he wanted to see become common. George Washington loved his porter, and he had his own brewery. The American brewing scene changed from English-style ales to Germanic lager-style products, progressively. The first brewery that I'd like to draw attention to in 1829 was that of Yuengling in Pennsylvania, David Yuengling. It's a brewery which survives to this day. But the first lager breweries were those of Lemp in St. Louis and Wagner in Philadelphia in 1840. Fred and Maximilian Schaefer opened their brewery in New York in 1842, and it was Bernard Stroh in 1850 who opened his brewery in Detroit. Ironically, on the day I landed in this country 10 years ago, it was announced that Stroh were getting out of brewing after 150 years. Those two events were not related. Frederick Miller was born in 1824 into a wealthy family from Riedlingen in Germany, and he studied brewing in France and in Germany, and landed in America in 1854 with a young wife, Josephine, and an infant son, and $9,000 worth of gold. After a year in New York, they settled in Milwaukee, and before very long, Frederick Miller had bought the Plank Road Brewery from Frederick Charles Best, from the same family that developed the Pabst brand. He paid $8,000 for the brewery. Now, beer at the time was retailing at less than 5 cents a glass in the taverns of Milwaukee. And in the first year after he bought the brewery, it produced 300 barrels of lager-style beer. By the time he died in 1888, the annual production was 80,000 barrels. The brewery in the Menominee Valley had a very good water supply and good access to local barley. He was a generous employer, opening a boarding house next to the brewery for unmarried staff. There were free meals and lodging, and salaries of up to $1,300 a year. But the workday started at 4 a.m. and finished at 6 p.m. So he wasn't anything other than expectant of hard work. The company was sold in 1969 to Philip Morris, and the company grew and grew, much of it on the basis of the Miller Lite brand. But in 2002, Miller were acquired by South African breweries to make SAB Miller, making them the second biggest brewing company in the world. In 1860, 55-year-old Eberhard Anheuser acquired the Bavarian company in St. Louis from George Schneider. At the time, there were 40 breweries in the Missouri city, and Anheuser ranked number 29. He had a daughter by the name of Lily, and she married another German by the name of Adolphus Busch, and the rest is history. A St. Louis winemaker and restaurateur, Carl Conrad, helped them develop a beer that would satisfy all beer drinkers and be of uniform quality wherever it was consumed, and of course the beer was called Budweiser. Busch brewed the product, Conrad bottled and distributed it, and in that first year, over 225,000 bottles were sold, and within 4 years, there were 2.3 million bottles of the beer sold, and it would go on to come, of course, the world's biggest selling beer. Since then, the company has passed through the leadership of several members of the Busch family. But in the year 2009, the company was acquired by InBev, making it by far and away the biggest brewing company in the world. In 1873, Adolf Coors stowed away on board a ship in Germany and found his way eventually to Golden, Colorado, and there he established the Coors Company, celebrating the Rocky Mountain water and building a brewery which at this time is the biggest single brewery anywhere in the world. If we look at the development of the brewing industry in the United States over the years since 1940, we see some remarkable changes. Back in 1940, Anheuser-Busch were comfortably number one, producing 2.5 million barrels of beer. The next biggest was Schlitz, producing 1.6 million barrels, but Schaefer was right up there at 1.4, also Pabst, of a similar production. Miller was only 0.5 million barrels, and Coors only 0.1. 10 years on, then we see that Schlitz has become the biggest brewing company in the United States of America with 5.1 million barrels, with Anheuser-Busch at 4.9 and Pabst at 3.8. Schaefer still right up there at 2.8 and Falstaff at 2.3. Miller now 2.1 million barrels and Coors starting to grow at 0.7. 10 years on to 1960, and we see that Anheuser-Busch once again are number one at 8.5 million barrels. Schlitz at 5.7, and Falstaff have grown to 4.9, with Carling from Canada just at 4.8, just 0.1 million barrels less. In 1970, we have Anheuser-Busch growing to 22.2 million barrels. Schlitz at 15.1 and Pabst at 10.5. Miller are behind Coors, for Coors are at 7.3 million barrels and Miller at 5.2. But through to 1980, and Anheuser-Busch ploughing ahead at 50.2 million barrels per year. Miller now have grown to 37.3 as they push forward with brands like Miller High Life and Miller Lite. Schlitz slightly behind Pabst now, both around 15 million barrels. But Schlitz, at that time, running into problems. They were pushing efficiency. They were claiming that they could steal a march on the rest of the brewing industry by speeding up their process. That was fine as far as it went, but they ran into a quality problem with bits in their beer, and the public were dissatisfied. The result was the death of the company, a remarkable story that illustrates the importance of attention to detail and not ignoring product quality. In the years since then, Anheuser-Busch, now Anheuser-Busch InBev, have grown and grown in size, so that now they are comfortably the world's biggest brewing company. Coors continue to grow, but Coors merged recently with Molson to form Molson Coors. But in North America, the Miller and the Coors organizations have merged their brewing interest in the United States. It's tremendously complicated. Anheuser-Busch InBev, Miller Coors, SAB Miller, Molson Coors. We're not quite sure who is doing what. If we go back to 1800 then, there were 150 breweries in the United States producing a total of 230,000 barrels. In 1873, there were 4,000 breweries, averaging 2,800 barrels each. By 1918, there were half as many breweries, but each of them was producing more than 56,000 barrels of beer per annum. So consolidation was starting. It really does not make sense to have large numbers of small breweries. It makes much more sense to have larger breweries satisfying a market over bigger and bigger distances away from the brewery. So the beer industry was growing. And in response to this, more and more people were concerned about abuse of alcohol. The temperance movement began in the United States in the early 19th century, with 13 states becoming dry between the years 1846 and 1855. It was Maine that led the way. Now, 1846, ironically, also was the year in which Carrie Nation was born, a doyen among prohibitionists. When everybody thinks about prohibition, they think of Carrie Nation, whose prayers and lectures in Kansas emerged or developed into physical acts of objection when her friends and she would go into bars and smash beer containers with hatchets hidden beneath their skirts. Many people viewed her really as a figure of some amusement, but there were people who were somewhat better organized than that. The Anti-Saloon League was formed in Washington in 1895, and for the first time prohibitionists had focus and organization. Indeed, there were widespread calls for prohibition when people were claiming excessive drunkenness was a problem for productivity during the First World War. And so, on January the 26th, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the American Constitution was enacted, and this forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, and was approved by all the states bar two. And so the Volstead Act of the same year was the basis on which the federal government enforced a block on all intoxicating liquor, which was defined as a drink containing more than 0.5% alcohol. Beer stocks were destroyed. 478 breweries were made unable to go about their primary business. Lemp, the brewery was one of the first lager breweries in the United States, closed their doors and they were never opened again. Other companies, including Anheuser-Busch, developed alternative products that their equipment might be turned to, things like ice cream, near beer, yeast, syrups, ginger beer, and so on. Of course, if you ban something like beer, then people will find a way to get it. And so the introduction of prohibition prompted the growth in illegal home brewing, and with the risks of that, illegal processes are invariably not of the same quality. Bootlegging, speakeasy culture that the movies so colourfully portray. Before Prohibition, there were 15,000 saloons in New York, and a year after the Volstead Act, there were twice as many speakeasies. The gangsters were the people who became the brewmasters, which can't be right. Drink-related crime surged. There was a 500% increase in drunk driving offences in Chicago. Well, by 1933, opinion in the United States had changed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Democrats had a slogan, a New Deal and a pot of beer for everyone. And the passage of the Cullen Act, or the Cullen Bill, allowed states not having local prohibition laws to sell beer containing 3.2% alcohol by weight. And on April the 7th, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution repealed the 18th Amendment, and whether to enforce prohibition or not became a state issue. Actually, it was Mississippi in 1966 who became the last to emerge from prohibition. It's actually said that on the day that the law was repealed and once more we could drink beer, Roosevelt said, "I think now it will be a very good time to have a beer." I note he didn't say it would be a good time to have a glass of Chardonnay. He said it would be a good time to have a beer. The United States is not the only country to embrace prohibition. And there are some remarkable examples over the years. For example, in Australia, during the 19th century, they had the peculiar concept of a 6 o'clock swill. The bars opened at 5 and closed at 6. And so when the workers clocked off from work at 5 o'clock, they dived into the pubs, and there were on the bar were all the glasses filled with beer. On the bar were all the glasses filled with beer. And as rapidly as they drank them, their beer was hosed in by the bartender, replenishing the glasses, and people would drink like crazy for an hour. It is a bizarre concept and illustrative of the ludicrousness of trying to ban people from drinking in moderation. So, if we think again, back to 1918, there were 2,000 breweries, each producing more than 56,000 barrels of beer each. Go forward to 1945, and we have just 465 breweries, each averaging the production of 190,000 barrels US. The first settlers were in places like Milwaukee, plentiful supply of ice, perfect for making Germanic-style lager beers. When von Linde developed the ability for artificial refrigeration, this meant that beer could be brewed any time, in any location. And not only that, it could be shipped through refrigerated containers across the railroads that were building across the country. And so this was the opportunity for companies to get bigger and bigger, and for very, very large companies to develop, shipping their beer nationwide. Earlier on, I talked about a great president. I talked about Jefferson wishing to see beer become common. Another president, Jimmy Carter, was the person who really allowed a new revolution in the world of beer. For Jimmy Carter signed into legislation the ability for people to make beer at home. This meant that people who were previously already brewing beer clandestinely at home were now able to come out of the closet and establish their own breweries, brew pubs, small breweries building up to regional craft breweries. And so there has been a remarkable growth in the craft brewing sector, such that now there are more than 1,400 breweries across the United States. A pub brewery sells the majority of its beer on site. So you go there and you buy your beer and enjoy it. Doubtless you'll also be eating some food at the same time. A lot of my students come to see me and say they'd like to start their own brewery. And I say, well, that's great. Make sure you've got a good bank manager and a good chef. Because it will be the chef making the food that will pay the bills on a day-to-day basis, and you'll be having fun brewing the beer. A microbrewery produces less than 15,000 barrels each year, and a regional brewery produces between 15,000 and 2 million barrels every year. These are somewhat artificial definitions, but nonetheless they illustrate the types and sizes of brewery in the craft sector in the United States. The craft sector is growing and growing, which is a very healthy sign. You have to remember that cumulatively, the volumes produced by all of these breweries is much smaller than the total amount of beer brewed by the mega companies. But it is growing sizably year on year. It also needs to be recognized that there is a failure rate. It's about 1 in 3 for these smaller breweries. New breweries are starting all the time, and some are going out of business, so there is a degree of turnover. The most recent data I have comes from 2000. In that year, 81 brew pubs and 21 microbreweries opened, but 69 brew pubs and 31 microbreweries closed. Let's take a look now at two great names in the world of craft brewing. And for the first of these, let's go back to the year 1965. In that year, the San Francisco Examiner declared Haight-Ashbury as the new Bohemia, and the Grateful Dead first came into existence. And a 28-year-old man was sitting in the old spaghetti factory in North Beach, and he fell in love with a beer by the name of Anchor Steam. That man was told that if he liked the beer so much, he'd better get himself down to the brewery because it was about to go out of business. The man, of course, was Fritz Maytag, and he bought the company, turned it around, and so now Fritz Maytag, with much justification, is regarded as the messiah of the brewing revolution in the United States. Maytag, of course, was born in Iowa into the appliance family, founded by his great-grandfather, F.L. Maytag I. They also went into cattle big time and established a cheese business, and so Maytag Blue Cheese is part of the same organization. Young Fritz was educated in the local public school, but came over to Stanford to study at Stanford. I believe he studied Japanese. These days, in this brewery on Mariposa Street on Potrero Hill, and the 13th biggest brewing company in the United States, he's making excellent beer, the Anchor Steam beer, of course. He does it in very traditional ways, paying full recognition to the importance of good scientific practice, some of the issues that I'll talk about in the last class. Fritz founded the Anchor Distilling Company in 1993, and the products include the single malt rye whiskey Old Potrero and Junipero gin. He owns the York Creek vineyards and presses his own fruit to make apple brandy and makes his own olive oil for private consumption. So he really is into many aspects of fermentation and foods. Some years ago he was impressed when reading and studying the Hymn to Ninkasi, a description of ancient brewing thousands of years ago. And so working with a historian by the name of Solomon Katz, Fritz made a beer according to the ancient Sumerian principles. Right the way down to drinking it from straws, because in those far-off days they would drink the beer from straw so as to leave the insoluble material left behind in the jar. If you ask Fritz what was the beer like, he says it wasn't terribly good, but we had tremendous fun making it. He is a tremendous enthusiast and a wonderful ambassador for the world of beer. One of the first brewers to build his own brewery in California was Jack McAuliffe, and he built the New Albion Brewery in Sonoma. And soon a succession of people were coming to that brewery to find out how he did it. One of those was a young man by the name of Ken Grossman. Ken, from Southern California, moved in 1972 to study science at Butte College and California State University, Chico. He found work as a bicycle repair man, but he was more enthusiastic about brewing beer. In fact, looking back, if you talk to Ken, he says he had the choice of deciding whether to go into bicycles or go into beer, and thank goodness he chose beer. And so in 1980, he opened the Sierra Nevada Brewery in Chico, a small warehouse in the city. And he would study at college, and he would brew his beer, and then he'd walk the streets of Chico, inquiring of people whether they would buy his beer. He made his own brewing equipment, and slowly and progressively he built up the business, such that now it is the third biggest American-owned brewery in the United States, selling beer in every state in the nation and also overseas. His flagship product, of course, is the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which we have talked about in the context of natural conditioning. But of course he makes many other fine beers with a distinctive hoppy character. The classic cascade character, the nice grapefruit character. So now he's producing more than 700,000 barrels of beer every year. Not only that, architecturally it is the most amazing brewery. Handcrafted tiles, murals on the wall, gleaming copper tanks. It really is spectacular. It's also environmentally fabulous. He has an anaerobic digester to process his waste, water. He has fuel cells. The spent grains from the brewery go to their own herd of cattle, converted into steaks, sold in his restaurant. He has more solar panels displayed around his brewery than any other private individual in the United States of America. And he has a wonderful meeting room, a function facility, where you can go and hold your wedding, your meeting, and they film television and radio programs for Chico's answer to Austin city limits. The beer is also extremely, extremely good. It's illustrative of really what has happened in the world of American brewing. There are some wonderful beers and always have been in the United States, and as I've said before, the gently flavoured North American lagers of their type are wonderful products. But the craft brewing revolution has introduced many more beer styles and new types of product which generate huge interest in beer in America. And everybody, large companies and small ones alike, delight in this revolution. So in this class we have looked at brewing in the United States of America. In the last class, we will look at what the future may hold in America and beyond, and how science has influenced brewing historically and will influence it in the future.
This ends Lecture 13. Brewmaster's Art, The History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 14. The Impact of Science on the Development of the Brewing Industry, Past, Present, and Future.
Let's finish this lecture course by talking about some science and scientific development and technological revolution. And if some people had their way, we really would be revolutionizing the brewing process. In particular, I'm thinking back to an old boss of mine who became the director of my organization in the early 1980s. And he confronted me one day and he said, "Stupid." And I said, "What, me, Bernard?" He said, "No, the whole process is stupid." I said, "How do you make that out?" He said, "Well, let's say you get a field of barley in Scandinavia. What's the first thing you do with the barley?" And I said, "Well, you dry it." "Okay, why do you dry it?" "Well, you dry it to lower the moisture content so that the barley does not spoil." "Okay, then what do you do?" "Well, you wait for the barley to free from dormancy." "Okay, how long does that take?" "Well, it could take a few weeks, a few months." "Then what do you do?" "Well, you steep it." "What, you add water to it, you mean?" I said, "Yes." "How long does that take?" I said, "About 2 days." "What do you do then?" "Well, you germinate it, you sprout it for about a week." "Ah, then what do you do?" "Well, you dry it. You drive off all the moisture on a kiln." "Oh, really? Then what do you do?" "Well, you store the malt for about a month." "Ah, I see. Then what do you do?" "Well, you grind it up, and then what?" "Oh, well, you add water." "Oh, I see, you add water back again. And you stir it around?" "Yes, and then what do you do?" "Well, you separate the water from the residual grains." "I see, and then what do you do?" I said, "Well, you boil it." "Oh, you drive off some more water." I said, "Yes." He said, "Stupid. Totally stupid, Charlie. Don't you see?" And that was the moment I realized that chemical engineers have no soul, but total logic. And really, if somebody was coming from a different planet, that's the way they would do it. They wouldn't be worrying about barley selection. They wouldn't be malting the grain. They wouldn't be extracting it and mashing and boiling and putting water in and taking water out. And they would do what Bernard wants to do, and that would be to add alcohol and add flavour and foam and colour from a bucket. It's logical. Fritz Maytag says it's got to feel right here, pointing to his head, but also it's got to feel right here, pointing to his heart. And that's exactly the way I feel about it. But logic will dictate what will happen in the future. We'll come back to that in a minute, but let's just, for a moment, look back at history. Let's go back to 1680 and to a draper in Delft, Holland, by the name of Antony van Leeuwenhoek. Now, I don't know how exciting or otherwise it is making curtains, but what Antony van Leeuwenhoek was interested in was making microscopes. And he used to fashion his own lenses and make microscopes and look at all sorts of things through these microscopes. He looked at scrapings from between his teeth and various bodily fluids, but happily for us, he also looked at a drop of fermenting beer. What he saw in there were little animalcules, little organisms wiggling around. What we now know he was looking at was yeast. So this really is the first man to see yeast. And so this really is the start of scientific discovery in the world of beer. The first textbook on brewing was written by Thomas Tryon in 1691, and he gave it the wonderful name, A New Art of Brewing Beer, Ale, and Other Sorts of Liquors, so as to render them more healthful to the body, to which is added the art of making malt, recommended to all brewers, gentlemen, and others that brew their own drink. So brewing textbooks were starting to be written, and scientific discoveries were being applied in the production of beer. For example, in 1762, an English brewer by the name of Michael Combroon applied a thermometer in the control of a brewery's operations. Before that time, the standard practice had been to poke your thumb into the boiled wort to ensure that it wasn't too hot to accommodate the yeast, the result being some pretty much scalded thumbs if you weren't careful. The thermometer now allowed you to get a better handle on what the precise temperature was. And then in 1784, John Richardson constructed the first brewery saccharometer, a device for measuring the sugar strength. We talked in an earlier class about extract, and the higher the level of sugars in the wort, the greater the specific gravity. This is what the saccharometer measured. Before that, there was some dispute about how strong a beer was. And because there were separate rates of tax, excise tax, for strong beer and small beer, it was important to know what the strength actually was. Again, it was settled by dipping a finger, presumably tasting for sweetness. The saccharometer allowed for a precise measurement of just how strong the wort was. 150 years after Antony van Leeuwenhoek made his observations, several people were claiming that yeast was a living organism that could bud and was responsible for making beer. Scientists like de la Tour and Schwann and Kutzing in Germany. But they were ridiculed by the chemists. Chemists insisted that beer could not possibly be made by an organism. It clearly was a process of a chemical reaction. And so eminent German chemists like Justus von Liebig and Friedrich Wöhler insisted that it was a chemical process. Indeed, they went so far as to spoof the claims that these animals, the little animalcules, were responsible for making beer. And they wrote, with sarcasm, "These animals have a stomach and an intestinal canal, and their urinary organs can be readily distinguished. The moment these animals are hatched, they begin to devour the sugar in the solution, which can be readily seen entering their stomachs. It is then immediately digested, and the digested product can be recognized with certainty in the excreta from the alimentary canal. In a word, these infusoria eat sugar, excrete alcohol from their intestinal canals, and carbonic acid from their urinary organs. The bladder, when full, is the shape of a champagne bottle, and when empty it resembles a little ball. With a little practice an air bladder can be detected in the interior of these animalculae. This swells up to 10 times its size, and is emptied by a sort of screw-like action effected by the agency of a series of ring-shaped muscles situated on the outside. Thank goodness there was the Frenchman Pasteur to sort out this stupidity. Louis Pasteur, who lived from 1822 to 1895 and who became the professor of chemistry at Lille University, was urged by the local brewers to sort out some difficulties they were having with beer going sour. In fact, he made a number of studies of beer and wine across the world. He wrote 2 books, one on wine, Études sur la vin, and another on beer, Études sur la bière. And he was the person who was able to conclude that alcoholic fermentation is an act correlated with the life and organization of a yeast cell. He wasn't the only person who was producing experiments to actually support this observation, but he was the one that was most prominently featured and the one we remember. But if we are talking about scientists that really influenced the study of yeast, then we go to 1883 and a man by the name of Emil Christian Hansen. He was the head of the physiological department of the Carlsberg laboratory in Copenhagen, and he was concerned by the rather too regular occurrence of brews which were unsellable, not because of infection by bacteria, but because of so-called wild yeasts. Now, a wild yeast is any yeast that's not the yeast that you think it is. So it's a foreign yeast. And so he was a person who observed that you really need to use pure yeast cultures. What Hansen did was to dilute and dilute the yeast until he arrived at one cell. And then he took that cell and he propagated it. He allowed it to bud and grow, such that as the yeast multiplied, all of the daughter cells came from the same single parent, a pure yeast culture. Indeed, it's this pure cell culture which is applied in so many fields in biotechnology these days, and it is one of the many scientific discoveries that came out of the brewing industry. And so Hansen's ideas expanded around the world such that most brewers in the world welcomed this approach to achieving consistency in their product. It is one of the examples of scientific work to achieve consistency in beer. There was one nation that disagreed, and of course it was the English. And what they said was they needed at least 2 yeasts. They needed the main yeast for fermentation, and they needed a second yeast which brought the beer into condition. As a gesture to the English, so it was that the technology embraced 2 yeasts, and the second yeast was named in honour of the source of this bias, and therefore the yeast was called Brettanomyces. Now, in the 100 years more since Hansen's discovery, there have been remarkable studies in the world of science, and remarkable studies in the world of the science of malting and brewing, and some famous names. In Burton-on-Trent, 100 or more years ago, there were 3 fellows of the Royal Society employed in brewing companies in Burton. The brewing industry recognized early on the importance of scientific discovery. They understood very early on the importance of studying the fundamentals of the raw materials, of the barley, of the hops, of the yeast. And as I've said, many of these discoveries spilled over into life in general. For example, James Prescott Joule was employed in a laboratory at his family brewery in Salford, England, when he contemplated the research that led the first law of thermodynamics. And of course, his name, the Joule, lends itself to the unit of energy. Søren Peder Lauritz Sørensen, working in the Carlsberg laboratory, was the man who came up with the concept of pH, the universal scale for measuring acidity and alkalinity. And of course, pH is an everyday term now. It came out of the brewing industry. And then a man by the name of W.S. Gossett, who was breeding new varieties of barley and hops for Guinness and applying statistical treatments, was banned from publishing his work. So he published the work under the pseudonym Student, and many of you will have heard of the statistical tool, the student t-test. That, too, came out of the brewing industry. The design of modern fermenters came out of the brewing industry. So much of modern fermentation technology emerged from brewing. Brewing science has been pursued for many years then, and it continues in universities, and it continues in brewing companies themselves. And the scientists associated with brewing have congregated into organizations for a number of years now. One of the first of these organizations was the Laboratory Club, which was established in London. And this soon became the Institute of Brewing. These days it is known as the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, and has expanded its remit because there is clear overlap in different beverage industries. One of the key products from the Institute of Brewing and Distilling is a series of examinations, and young people and older people alike studying brewing can take these examinations every year as an index, as a certificate of their qualifications for brewing. So some of my students at Davis take these examinations as a testimony to their knowledge and aptitude. Other organizations include the European Brewery Convention, based in Zoeterwoude, Holland, and in America, two organizations, the American Society of Brewing Chemists and the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. All of these organizations are meeting points for brewers and brewing scientists, and there are meetings all over the world to discuss the latest developments in the understanding of the malting and brewing process. They publish journals. I myself am the editor of the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists. And one of the other important roles that these organizations fulfill is the agreement of methodology. In particular, the European Brewery Convention, the EBC, and the American Society of Brewing Chemists, the ASBC, have recommended methods. And these recommended methods, covering everything from raw materials through the process to waste products and co-products, these methods are meant to allow us to achieve consistency in our operations. For example, if you want to make a measurement on barley, if you don't have commonality of methods, and the barley supplier and the maltster use different methods, the chances are they'll get different results. So by having standard methods and the same method applied by the supplier and the user, then you hope to get agreement, and if there are differences, they will be highlighted. So these standard methods have been developed to facilitate control in the malting and brewing operations, and it is further testimony to the sharing that goes on in the industry as people seek to achieve excellence. But what of the future? How will science change the future? And will my chemical engineering friends' vision of a process based totally on flavouring alcohol at the end really come to play? Perhaps it may. I'd like to draw your attention to two different categories of product in the world. The first of these is the so-called malternatives in the United States. Sometimes they're called flavoured alcoholic beverages. They're called malternatives because they are based on bland, unhopped beers. Brewers produce these bland, flavourless products, and then they are decolorized to strip out the yellow or amber colour, and flavours can be added, different fruit-type flavours and so on. And so they are marketed, often with names that you are more likely to associate with spirit products. But the reason they're based on beer is that it attracts a lower rate of taxation. Now, in some parts of the United States, they're seeking to correct this. They are seeking to tax them as spirits because they feel that these products are being targeted at younger people. The reality is that the strength, the alcoholic strength of these products is very similar to that of beers. And they are made in breweries from brewery raw materials. It's a moot point whether they are beers. They're certainly not spirits. But it is the taxation that drives the production protocols that are used to make these products. So what have we got? We've got a bland alcohol source mixed with a flavouring. Surely that is what my colleague was talking about. Would it make sense then to simply use any supply of alcohol? If we could bring in alcohol to the factory and add flavour to it, is that what we would do if we could find a suitable beer flavour? The thing that would argue against that is taxation, because at the moment that certainly would not be taxed as a beer, and therefore it would be prohibitively expensive. The problem also is there simply is not an understanding of beer flavour that will allow this at this point in time. We've said a lot in this class about flavour of beer. We've talked about the contributions of malt, of hops, of the yeast, of salts from the water, and so on. And the simple reality is that although we know much about the individual compounds, we do not know how to assemble them artificially to recreate a beer. It can't be done. We've tried, trust me, and clearly it tastes reminiscent of beer. Such a product tastes reminiscent of beer, but I can tell you it's nowhere near acceptable, in my humble opinion. But who knows what the future will hold, and I'm sure as flavour technology improves, so will people embrace this as a possibility. Let me take you to Japan and the contrary approach and a contrary impact of taxation. It was discovered that there was a loophole in the tax legislation in Japan, such that if you had less than 25% malt in your product, then you could attract a lower rate of taxation. And so a genre was established called happoshu. These products, because of the lower taxation, were much cheaper. They were packaged in beer bottles and with beer-style imagery. They could not be called beer, but they were right alongside the beer on the supermarket shelves. And so, at home, during the week, men and women would drink happoshu. But if the people were coming for dinner at the weekend, to impress them, you would give them the regular beer. But nonetheless, this meant that there was a huge growth in this category of happoshu, and a similar decline in the amount of regular beer that was being brewed, all because of taxation. Then somebody realized that if you had 0% malt, then you had the opportunity for so-called third category products. These products were cheaper still, made from things like sugar and soybeans and pea starch and who knows what else. To my palate, not as good. But clearly, they had the characteristics of beer-type products. They were alongside the beer-type products, and because they were substantially cheaper, so they were bought in preference. Now again, as flavour technology improves, and as this type of product can become better and better in terms of flavour delivery, this will be a major opening and a major opportunity for brews or for brewers to produce beers in an entirely different way. What will be the driving force for doing that? One of the driving forces will be the ongoing availability of raw materials. At the moment, there is a risk of a shortage of malting quality barley. And in an earlier class, we did talk about the demands that are made for malting quality barley. and the risk that at the end of the harvest your crop will not meet the requirements of the maltster, and you would have to sell it for feed. So in some places there is a reluctance to grow malting quality barley. So how much of this will be available in the future? And how much will be available close to the regions where the market is growing? Remembering that growth locations are places like China and India and Korea. What about other raw materials? How readily will they be available? How much easier it would be, logistically, if you could simply dial in the cheapest supply of starch or the cheapest supply of sugar and have the wherewithal to convert that into the product that you want. Environmentally, also, there are questions. We've talked about the very high usage of water. What are the opportunities for minimizing water usage? For example, a lot of water is used in malting of barley. So much water used in cleaning breweries and cleaning brewery tanks. Many brewers would like to go to continuous processing that runs the whole time, and you don't have to keep stripping down and cleaning in between successive batches, and so on. So there are environmental driving forces as well. But there are also driving forces that are dictated by customer demand. Many people like to drink alternatives. These are perhaps somewhat easier to drink than some of the more robustly flavoured beers. Just because you and I like beers the way they are at the moment does not necessarily mean that the drinker of tomorrow will take that as the beverage of choice. And certainly the more that the younger drinking population drink products like alternatives these days, the less likelihood there is that they will shift to beer. That's a doom scenario. I hope I'm wrong there. And personally, I would like to think that brewers will always champion beer. If I had a crystal ball, I would forecast two extremes for the future. I would suggest that sooner or later, it may be 20 years or 30 years, perhaps 50 or more, there will be large alcohol processing factories where alcohol is produced and alcoholic beverages are made from it downstream by the additions of flavours and colours and foam and so on. At the other extreme, there is something I would call the slow beer movement, analogous to the slow food movement. And this will be beers produced in the time-honoured fashion according to traditional recipes and traditional approaches. And these will be highly prized products consumed by the cognoscenti and celebrated for their values that speak to the time-honoured tradition. These will be products that will be enjoyed by the cognoscenti, who will celebrate beer as it was always produced and always enjoyed. I know which camp I will be in, and I will be drinking the latter, but the scientist in me will be obliged to look at the opportunities for the first of these approaches. What I would like to see from all brewers everywhere is them celebrating beer, no matter how it's produced, and I would like to see them celebrating beer for its merits and its qualities, no matter whether they are a very small brewing company or a very large one. I would like them to learn something from the world of wine. I'd like them to champion their raw materials. As I said before, I'd like them to speak with pleasure and delight about the nuances of the flavours that come from their malts and their hops. They might even market it that way. And always I hope they will not lose sight of their humour and their good intentions and their attention to quality, to good scientific principles and consistent technological application. I think the brewing industry will continue to lead the way in the scientific discovery in the world of alcoholic beverages. I think it will continue to be a champion of all that is right. And I hope that you, my listeners, will now have a far better appreciation of the merits and the standards and the excellence of beer. So that's it. We've come to the end of our course. And in this class, we have looked at such a diversity of topics. We started by looking at the shape of the world's brewing industry. How much beer is brewed, who buy, where they brew it, who drinks the most, who drinks the least. We have looked at large and small brewing companies. And then we summarized the basics of brewing. We looked through the whole process as a prelude to what had to follow. We considered the history of brewing, its ancient origins in Sumeria, and how it moved around the world. And then we looked at the raw materials that are so important to the process of brewing. We looked at the barley and other cereals. We looked at adjuncts. We looked at hops and water, where they come from, how they are very, very carefully chosen. We talked about the malting process. We talked about the brew house, the hot side of the process, the emphasis that is placed on producing a fermentable wort that is the perfect wort to produce the beer that you want. And then we looked at yeast and how brewers are conscientious about choosing the right yeast for their product and how they control the action of that yeast in fermentation systems and then downstream clean up the beer, refine the beer, and efficiently and rapidly put it into the appropriate package. We talked about beer styles. We talked about top fermentation beers. We talked about bottom fermentation beers, the overlap between them, and the way in which new beers are arriving all the time, and how difficult it is to sometimes pigeonhole them as one product or another. We talked about the quality of beer, the vast myriad of chemical substances natural to beer that influence the flavour. And then we talked about the foam and the colour and the clarity and how they influence the perception of beer quality. We talked about changes that take place in beer with time, how beer is unstable, it loses its freshness, it develops turbidity, it runs the risk of gushing, and how it is susceptible to spoilage by some microorganisms, but is generally relatively microbiologically robust. We talked about beer and health, and how beer is not empty calories, and it may very really and very genuinely have a beneficial impact on the body when consumed in moderation, and how, in comparison to wine, it has a lot going for it. Much more diversity, just as good as wine in pairing with many, many foodstuffs, but how it's perceived somehow as being inferior and how unjustified that perception really is. We talked about beer in the United States of America, the traditions and the changes that are taking place and the remarkable growth in the craft beer sector. And finally, we talked about scientific inquiry in the world of brewing, how science has been applied and investigated in the context of beer over a number of years, and how the future may be influenced by this science, and how the availability of raw materials in the future may impact on the way in which beer is made in the future. Whichever way beer is made in the future, we can be confident that brewers will always adhere to the highest possible standards and will also be striving to delight the customer.
This ends Lecture 14. If you've enjoyed this program, the Modern Scholar series from Recorded Books offers courses in a variety of subject areas taught by some of the world's greatest professors. Call 1-800-636-3399 or visit the course's webpage for a free catalog. This course, produced and directed by Ian McCulloch and edited by Stephen Mosblek and Mark Avila, is copyrighted 2009 by Recorded Books, LLC. The lecture text is copyrighted 2009 by Charles Bamforth.